I never wanted this job, let me be clear about that from the very beginning, because everything that happened afterward, every stolen glance, every barely there smile, every moment that made my heart feel like it was dissolving in my chest, started with a desperate Tuesday morning and a job listing I almost scrolled past. My name is Alexis Reeves. I am 26 years old, recently unemployed, freshly humiliated by the collapse of a startup I had given 3 years of my life to, and standing outside a glass tower in the middle of the city with a resume that was still slightly damp from the rain I had sprinted through to get here on time. The building was called Halcyon Group. 42 floors of steel, glass, and the kind of architectural arrogance that said, "We are not just successful, we are inevitable." I stood on the sidewalk, looked up at it, and felt something between awe and nausea. The job listing had been straightforward. Executive Administrative Assistant to the CEO. Competitive salary. Benefits. Discretion required. I had applied on a whim. I had gotten a callback in 20 minutes. I had passed 3 rounds of interviews with HR and 2 senior directors. And now, after all of that, I was about to meet the man I would be working for directly. His name was Jasper George. I had done my research, of course. Everyone had. Jasper George was not the kind of person you could avoid knowing about if you worked anywhere in the corporate ecosystem of this city. He had taken over Halcyon Group at 29 after his father's retirement, had restructured the entire company within 18 months, had tripled the valuation in 4 years, and had never, in any interview or profile or public appearance, smiled, not once. There were entire comment sections dedicated to this fact. The internet had given him a nickname. The Ice King Alpha. It was meant to be intimidating, I think, or maybe mocking. But somehow it had become admiring over time, the way the internet sometimes decides to love the things it pretends to fear. I had seen photographs of him. Dark hair, always perfectly placed. Eyes the color of deep water on a cloudy day, a blue so dark it was almost gray. Almost green, depending on the light. A jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who took their craft very seriously. He was tall in every photo, broad-shouldered, always dressed in something dark and immaculately fitted. He looked like a man who had never been inconvenienced in his life. Standing in the lobby, waiting for my escort to the 40th floor, I told myself that it was fine. I was professional. I had handled difficult bosses before. I could handle cold and distant. Cold and distant was manageable. I was wrong. But not in the way I expected. The elevator opened onto the executive floor and the first thing I noticed was the temperature. It was at least 4 degrees colder up here than in the lobby. I pulled the lapels of my jacket a little closer together and followed the HR director, a brisk woman named Ms. Harmon, down a corridor lined with frosted glass panels. "Mr. George keeps specific temperature preferences in his workspace," Ms. Harmon said, without looking at me. "You'll adjust, of course," I said. She stopped outside a large door at the end of the corridor. The nameplate beside it was clean and minimal. Jasper George. Chief Executive Officer. She knocked once, sharp and precise. "Come in," said a voice, and that was the first time I heard it. His voice. Low and even, the kind of voice that did not rise or fall unnecessarily, that did not waste itself on inflection. It landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water, quiet, but with ripples that spread further than you expected. Ms. Harmon opened the door. The office was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 walls, looking out over the city like it was something that belonged to him. The desk was dark wood and glass, clean to the point of being almost empty. 1 monitor. 1 pen. 1 folder, and behind all of it, Jasper George. He was looking down at the folder when we walked in. He did not look up immediately, and for a moment I just stood there and took him in the way you take in something that is slightly more real than you prepared yourself for. The photographs had been accurate. But they had not captured the way he held himself, utterly still, completely self-contained, as if the space around him existed on his terms. He was wearing a charcoal suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, and his dark hair was pushed back just slightly, like he had run a hand through it at some point in the morning and then forgotten about it. He looked up, his eyes were darker than I expected. Not the soft gray-blue of photos. In person, with the city light behind him, they were closer to the color of deep ocean water, and they landed on me with the same weight as his voice. Assessing. Precise. Giving away nothing, Mr. Reeves, he said. Not a question. Just acknowledgement. Yes, I said. Alexis. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. George. He held my gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked back at his folder. Miss Harmon will show you your workstation. I'll need the Mercer file compiled by 3. The inbox protocol document is in your system. Read it before you do anything else. That was it. That was my welcome. Miss Harmon led me out. I glanced back once before the door closed and caught him already writing something. His attention returned entirely to whatever was in that folder, as if I had already ceased to exist. I thought, well, this will be fine. He's just busy. Reader, it was not fine. But it became, against all logic and reason. The best thing that ever happened to me, my workstation was directly outside Jasper's office. A desk with a clear sight line to his door, positioned so that I could intercept anyone approaching before they knocked. It was a position of access and proximity, which I understood intellectually, but which felt, in practice, like being stationed very close to a weather system you weren't entirely sure you could predict. The inbox protocol document was 17 pages long. I read it twice. It detailed, with extraordinary precision, exactly how Jasper George liked his communications managed. Color-coded priority flags. Response windows for different categories. Specific language to use when deferring or declining on his behalf. A list of 12 names who were always to be put through immediately, no exceptions. A list of 4 names who were never, under any circumstances, to be connected to him without his explicit written approval. It was, I thought, the document of a man who had been disappointed by ambiguity. I spent my first morning learning the system. I answered emails. I compiled the Mercer file. I arranged 2 calendar items and rescheduled one. At 12:30, his door opened. He walked past my desk without looking at me, said, "Lunch." Back at 1:15, and got into the elevator. I stared at the closed elevator doors. Okay. Fine. He was not a small talk person. That was fine. I was not here for small talk. I was here to be efficient and professional and to rebuild my savings after the startup disaster and to stop thinking about all the ways the last 3 years of my life had gone sideways. I ate my lunch at my desk and kept working. He came back at 1:13. 2 minutes early. He paused, just barely, when he walked past, and I had the distinct impression that he had glanced at my desk. I was looking at my screen. By the time I looked up, he was already through his door. I told myself I imagined it. This became the rhythm of the first week. He was precise, demanding, and almost entirely silent in any way that was not work-related. He communicated through notes left on my desk when I stepped away. Through terse 2-line emails, through the occasional appearance in his doorway where he would say something like, "The Donovan presentation needs a hard copy for tomorrow's board meeting," or, "I need the Jakarta call moved to Thursday." He never said please. He also never said anything unkind. He just spoke in the language of tasks and expectations, and the only way to know he was satisfied was the absence of correction. I was good at this kind of work. I had always been organized, quick, detail-oriented. By the end of week 1, I had already streamlined 2 of his filing systems and anticipated 3 things he needed before he asked for them. On Friday afternoon, I placed a compiled briefing document on his desk for Monday morning's meetings. He was on a call. He glanced at it, then at me, then gave one small nod. I walked back to my desk feeling inexplicably like I had just been awarded a gold star. This was embarrassing. I knew that. But there was something about earning even the smallest acknowledgement from a man who gave acknowledgements like they were a finite resource that felt strangely significant. I went home that weekend and did not think about him. I thought about him a little. But that's allowed. He was interesting in the way that locked rooms are interesting. You don't necessarily want to go in. You just want to know what's inside. The second week brought what I would come to think of as the coffee situation. I had noticed, over the first week, that Jasper George drank exactly 2 cups of coffee per day. One at 8:15, one at 2 o'clock. They were always brought up from the building's cafe by the previous assistant, apparently, delivered in a specific cup, with specific milk ratio, no sugar. There had been a brief gap between assistants. Nobody had told me about the coffee. On Monday of week 2, at 8:14, he appeared in his doorway. "Coffee," he said. I looked up. "I'm sorry, I don't think I was briefed on, second floor cafe. Cortado. Oat milk. No sugar, right? Of course. I'll get that now." I went down, got the coffee, came back up. Handed it to him. He looked at the cup, then at me. "It's a Cortado," I said. "Oat milk, no sugar." I confirmed with the barista. He took it. Went back into his office. Closed the door. "Okay. Good. Fine." At 2 o'clock, I had the second cup ready at his door before he came out for it. He opened the door, saw the cup on the edge of my desk positioned toward him. And stopped. A pause. Just a second or two. Then he picked it up, looked at it, and looked at me. "You didn't wait for me to ask," he said. "You drink one at 8:15 and one at 2. I figured it was easier." Another pause. "Longer this time, thank you," he said, and that was the first time Jasper George said thank you to me. "I have thought about this more than I am willing to publicly admit." He went back into his office. I turned back to my screen. Smiled at it for approximately 4 seconds. Then got back to work. This continued. Every day, 2 coffees, perfectly timed. He started leaving for his 2 o'clock Cortado exactly when I placed it, as if he could sense it. On Thursday of that week, he came out at 1:58, looked at the desk, looked at me. "You're early," he said. The cafe was quiet, something almost, moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like the idea of one that he had not fully committed to yet. "Efficient," he said, and went back in. I told my best friend Gideon about this on the phone that evening and he said, "That is the least romantic thing I have ever heard," and I said, "You don't understand," and he said, "You're developing feelings for a man who complimented your coffee logistics," and I said, "Good night Gideon," and hung up. He wasn't wrong. But he also wasn't entirely right. Here is the thing about being stationed outside someone's office. You walk past it constantly. That's just the nature of the geography. Going to the printer, past his office. Going to the kitchenette, past his office. Going to the conference room, the filing room, the elevator, past his office. The wall facing my desk was glass, frosted to mid-height for privacy, but clear above that. And Jasper's desk faced the window, which meant that from a certain angle, if you were walking past at the right moment, you could see him working. I am not saying I timed my walks. I am saying I became aware, gradually, of a phenomenon. If you are still watching, subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now let's see what happens next. Every time I walked past his office, something happened. The first time I noticed it was during week 3. I was heading to the printer, arms full of a revised contract. I walked past the glass. And in my peripheral vision, I was not looking, I want to be clear, I was focused on not dropping 40 pages of legal text. I caught movement. He had looked up. I kept walking. On the way back, same thing. A flicker of motion from inside. I told myself it was nothing. He was probably looking at the corridor in general. He was probably tracking movement as a habitual awareness thing. He was a CEO. He was busy. He was not looking at me specifically, except, the next day, same thing. The day after. Every single time I walked past the glass wall. If he was in his office and I was in motion, he looked up, not for long. Not in a way that anyone else would notice. A brief, precise movement of his gaze, like a compass needle swinging toward a direction before being pulled back. I started noticing it the way you notice music in a room you thought was quiet. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. By the end of week 3, I had confirmed it thoroughly enough to be unsettled by it. He tracked me. Every single time. And every single time, the moment my eyes moved toward his office, he was already looking back at whatever was on his desk. This could mean many things, I told myself. Hypervigilance. He was a high-stakes executive. Monitoring movement near his office was probably instinctive, habit. He looked up at motion the way anyone might. Something else, I told Gideon about it. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Alexis, baby, that man is watching you. He's not watching me, he's just, every time you walk past. Every single time. It could be coincidence. It is absolutely not coincidence." I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling and decided to test it. The next morning, I made 3 unnecessary trips past his office. To the kitchenette when I didn't need anything. Back. To the supply cabinet for a pen I had at my desk. Back, all 6 passes. He looked up. All 6 times, by the time my gaze reached his window. He was already looking down. I returned to my desk with my heart doing something completely unreasonable. This was a problem. This was, in fact, a problem on multiple levels. Level 1, he was my boss. Level 2, I did not know anything about his personal life or orientations, and I was making enormous assumptions based on the fact that a man looked up from his desk when someone walked past his office. Level 3, even if every assumption I was making was correct, this was still my boss, and I needed this job. And I had promised myself after the startup disaster that I would make professional decisions with my professional life. Level 4, I had been telling myself I wasn't attracted to him, and that was obviously and completely a lie that I needed to stop telling myself. Jasper George was, when I permitted myself to actually think about it, extraordinarily attractive. Not just physically, though that was undeniable. There was something about the way he existed in a room, that absolute self-containment, that economy of movement and expression, that was deeply compelling. He didn't try to take up space. He just did. Entirely, completely, without effort, and underneath the cold surface, I had started to see things that the internet profiles hadn't mentioned, the way he always read the full document before asking a question. The way he never raised his voice. The way, when I had stayed late on a Wednesday to finish a report he needed for an early Thursday meeting. A car service had appeared at my desk at 9 p.m. with the message, "Use this, it's late," in his exact font from his exact email. He didn't say anything about it the next morning. Just arrived, collected his 8:15 coffee, and nodded once when I handed him the finished report, but he had noticed I was staying late. He had done something about it. Quietly, practically, without making it into anything, I was in trouble. Over the following weeks, I accumulated knowledge about him the way you accumulate knowledge about a place you visit every day, not all at once, but in layers, each one adding depth and detail to the image. He took his lunch alone. Always. He had a standing reservation at a restaurant 2 blocks away. Always the same table, and he ate while reading, and he always ordered the same 3 things in rotation. He did not like phone calls. He tolerated them, but he vastly preferred written communication. His emails were models of clarity and brevity, never more than 3 sentences unless absolute necessity demanded it. He had a plant on the windowsill of his office. One small succulent, almost aggressively low maintenance. I noticed it had been recently watered one Monday and tried not to find this charming. He listened to music through one earbud when he thought no one would come by. I only discovered this because I knocked on his door during what I thought was a gap in his schedule, and he pulled the earbud out so quickly it bounced against his chest. He looked faintly caught out for approximately half a second before composure reasserted itself. I pretended not to notice. I noticed. He worked late. Not performatively, not to impress anyone. The executive floor emptied at 6, 7 at the latest, and he was still there at 8, 9, sometimes 10. I knew because on the days I stayed late to finish complex projects, his light was always on. We had developed a kind of parallel late-night rhythm that neither of us acknowledged. He would emerge from his office at some point, find me still at my desk, pause for a beat longer than necessary, and then say something like, "The Alderton report can wait until morning," or "You don't need to stay for the Whitfield summary." "I'll handle it." He was, I realized, giving me permission to leave. I did not always take it. And I was not entirely sure why. One evening in the 6th week, he came out of his office at 8:45 and found me finishing a spreadsheet analysis he hadn't asked me to do but that I knew he would need the next morning. He stopped beside my desk, looked at the screen. "I didn't ask for that," he said. "You have the Bellamy Group call at 9 a.m. and you didn't have the Q3 numbers formatted for comparison. I thought it would be useful." He was quiet for a moment. "It is," he said. Then, "Have you eaten?" I looked up. That was not a question he had ever asked me. I had something at my desk earlier. I said. Another pause. He seemed to be considering something. Then he said, "There's food in the kitchen. Executive floor. It's stocked for late meetings." "Oh. Thank you." He nodded and went back into his office. I sat there for a moment, feeling warm in a way that was completely disproportionate to being told that there were snacks in the kitchen. Then I went and found the kitchen, which was indeed stocked beautifully, and I ate a small plate of very good food and stared at the city lights below and thought about a man who didn't know how to say "Are you okay?" but knew how to make sure you had eaten. It was in the 8th week that things shifted in a way I couldn't easily categorize or explain away. There was a 2-day industry conference that Halcyon Group was attending. Actually, that Halcyon Group was co-hosting, which meant Jasper was the primary representative and I was going as his assistant to manage logistics, scheduling, and the inevitable avalanche of things that needed to be handled in real time. We took a car to the conference hotel together. 40 minutes, just the two of us. I had prepared a briefing packet for the drive. I handed it to him as the car pulled away from the building. He took it, opened it, and began to read. I looked out the window. After about 15 minutes, he said, "The Prescott introduction runs long." I trimmed it to 3 minutes. The original was 6, good. They tend to fill silence when they're nervous. A pause. "You've met Prescott." I handled his assistant's coordination calls. "He talks a lot during pauses." Another pause, and then something happened that I was not prepared for. Jasper George made a sound. Small, brief, pressed through his nose and barely there, but it was, unmistakably, a laugh. Or the closest thing to one that I had heard from him. I kept looking out the window. I was smiling and I did not want him to see it. "Good observation," he said, and went back to the packet. The conference was chaotic in all the ways industry conferences are chaotic. People who wanted 5 minutes with Jasper, which turned into 15. A panel running long. A venue mix-up with one of the breakout rooms. I handled all of it, one thing at a time, and by the end of the first day I was exhausted but functioning. At 6 p.m., between the day sessions and the evening networking reception, there was a 90-minute gap. I sat in a chair in the corridor outside the main hall and closed my eyes for a moment. I felt someone stop near me. I opened my eyes. Jasper was standing there, jacket now off, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked, I want to be precise about this, he looked less armored than usual. The conference had been demanding for him too, I realized. Not logistically, the way it had been for me, but socially. 2 days of sustained performance as the face of the company. For a man who preferred written communication and solitude and the exact temperature of his own office, this had to be its own kind of exhausting. He sat down in the chair beside mine. Not close, but not far. Comfortable distance. We were quiet for a moment. "Good first day," he said. "The Bellamy panel went well." I said, "It did." A pause. "The Prescott thing was better than I expected." 3 minutes was right, I nodded. More silence. But it was different from the silence at the office. That silence was professional. This one was something else. It had texture. "Do you want to work in this industry long term?" he asked. I looked at him. It was the first personal question he had ever asked me, honestly. I'm not sure. I was in tech startups before this. That ended, not well. I'm still figuring out what I want the next chapter to look like. He considered this. "What did you build?" "Productivity software. B2B. We had something real for about 18 months and then the funding rounds got messy and it fell apart." "Did you see it coming?" "Probably earlier than I admitted to myself." He nodded slowly. And then he said, quiet and even, "I spent 2 years after university trying to build something that had nothing to do with this company. Sustainable infrastructure startup. It failed. I didn't handle it well." I looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, not at me, but his voice had something in it that it didn't usually have. Something unguarded. "I didn't know that," I said. "It's not something I discuss. Why tell me?" A pause. Long enough that I thought he might not answer. because you looked like you were still blaming yourself for something that was probably more complicated than one person's fault," he said. "And I know what that looks like." I sat with that for a moment. Felt it settle somewhere in my chest that was not entirely comfortable. "Thank you," I said. "For saying that," he nodded. Got up, straightened his jacket. "Reception starts in 40 minutes, he said. "The Alderton group will want 10 minutes minimum. Brief me on their current priorities before we go in," and just like that, we were back. Professional. Efficient. The moment folded up and put away somewhere, but it had happened. I was not going to pretend it hadn't. The reception was exactly as demanding as expected, and Jasper was exactly as I would have predicted: precise, controlled, and impossible to read unless you had spent 8 weeks learning the small signals. The slight tension in his jaw when a conversation ran long. The way his gaze tracked me across the room when I was managing something, not with urgency but with awareness. At 10:30, the last guests were drifting out. I was collecting briefing materials from the side table when I heard him beside me. "You can leave these for the hotel staff," he said. "There are a few things I want to make sure don't get misplaced." A pause. "I meant you could stop," he said, and something in his voice was almost gentle. I stopped. Looked at him, in the half-emptied reception room, with the city night visible through the tall windows and the last of the overhead lights dimmed for atmosphere. He looked different. Not less like himself, but more like a version of himself that had let something down that he usually kept raised. "Long day," I said. "They always are at these things." He paused. "You were good today. You handled everything. That's the job. You handled things I didn't ask you to handle, before they became problems." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, I was paying attention, and he looked at me for a moment, actually looked at me. Not the assessing professional look he'd aimed at me on day one, but something slower, something that moved differently through his eyes, and said, "I know." Then his phone buzzed and the moment broke and we went back to being exactly what we were supposed to be. But I lay awake in my hotel room for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, having a very honest conversation with myself about what was happening. I was falling for him. I had been falling for him for weeks. And something I could not name precisely but could feel the shape of, the way you feel the presence of a large thing in the dark, told me it was not entirely one-sided, which was either wonderful or catastrophic. And I had not yet figured out which. Returning to normal after the conference felt strange. Everything was the same desk, the same cold air on the executive floor, the same inbox protocol, but I was aware of the texture of things in a way I hadn't been before. The way he said, "Good morning," now was the same as it had always been, brief and unadorned, but I heard more in it than I used to. Or maybe I was projecting. That was genuinely possible. The coffee ritual continued. The daily walks past his office continued. The late evenings continued. What changed was something subtler. He started talking to me, not a lot. Not the way people who like to talk. But more than before. When he came out for his 2 o'clock court adieu, sometimes he would pause a moment longer. Ask something work adjacent that wasn't strictly necessary. Comment on something in the news. Once, entirely unprompted, he told me that the restaurant downstairs had changed their lunch menu and it was, in his exact phrasing, a poor decision. I made a sound very close to laughing. He looked at me with something in his eyes that was dangerously close to pleased. Their previous menu had been unchanged for 4 years, he said. Consistency is undervalued, or maybe they needed to try something new, a beat. You're going to argue in favor of change for its own sake, not for its own sake. But for the sake of not being so comfortable with a pattern that you stop questioning whether it's still the right one. He was quiet for a moment. Then, point taken, and he went back into his office with his coffee, and I sat at my desk and thought about how we had just had an argument about a restaurant menu that was clearly about something else entirely, and neither of us had said what it was actually about. This was becoming a problem. A wonderful, terrifying problem. I called Gideon on a Friday night and told him everything. The conference, the chair in the corridor, the restaurant menu conversation, the way he looked up every single time I walked past, the car service on the late night. All of it. Gideon was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Gideon, I am processing," he said, "the fact that you have been living in what sounds like a slow-burn romantic drama for 2 months and telling me almost nothing about it." I was telling myself it wasn't anything. Alexis. Alexis. He sends a car for you. He tells you about his failed startup. He looks up every time you walk past his office. That could be hypervigilance. It absolutely cannot. That is a man who cannot stop looking at you and is very bad at hiding it while trying very hard to hide it. He sounds like every emotionally repressed love interest in every story I have ever read. He's my boss, Gideon, I know. This could be very bad for me professionally if I'm reading it wrong, I know, and even if I'm reading it right, I don't know that he, Alexis. Gideon's voice was kind and direct, the way it always was when he had decided to cut through the noise. What do you want? A long pause. I want to know what he's thinking, I said finally. That's not what I asked. A longer pause. I want him to look at me the way he looks at that window when he thinks no one is watching, I said, and felt my face warm as I said it, even alone in my apartment. Gideon said, gently, then you might have to do something about that. I hate this. You love this. He wasn't wrong about that either. 3 weeks after the conference, 2 things happened in the same day. The first was small. I was printing a document and walked past his office and glanced in, as I always did. He was on a call, standing rather than sitting, which he rarely did, looking out the window. He didn't look up this time. I kept walking. I came back. He was still on the call. He still didn't look up. I told myself this meant nothing. Sometimes he was on calls. Sometimes he was focused. There was nothing meaningful about a pattern having one exception, except that I spent the rest of the morning vaguely unsettled in a way I could not logically justify. This, I told myself, is called attachment. This is called having developed feelings for someone to the degree that an absence of their usual behavior registers as a disruption to your equilibrium. This is, in short, a problem. The second thing happened at 3 in the afternoon. I was working on a document consolidation when I discovered, entirely by accident, a folder misfiled in the shared executive drive. It was labeled with a date from 6 months prior, before I had started, and when I opened it to check if it needed to be reclassified, I saw its title, ARA Shortlist, Executive Assistant Final Candidates. I should have closed it. Instead, I scrolled. There were 4 names. Mine was the last one. The notes beside each name were in different handwriting, HR, mostly, except for the final column, which was labeled CEO Review, beside the other 3 names. The CEO column was empty or had single check marks. Beside mine, there was a note. 3 words, in the precise, minimal handwriting I had come to recognize as his, hire immediately. Yes. I sat very still for a moment. He had reviewed the candidate shortlist. He had, from whatever was in my file and the preceding 3 rounds of interviews that he had not attended, decided based on paperwork and reports from other people that I was the one he wanted, hire immediately. Yes. It was not a love letter. It was not even a compliment, technically. It was a business decision about a staffing matter, but it was the most direct evidence I had ever had that Jasper George had, at some point, for some reason, wanted specifically me in this role. Not just anyone qualified. Me. I closed the folder. Filed it correctly. Went back to my work. At 4 o'clock, his door opened and he came out. He stopped beside my desk in the way he sometimes did. The Prescott follow-up is drafted, I said, without looking up. You'll have it in your inbox by 5, a pause. I looked up. He was looking at me with that look again. The slow one. The one that moved differently. Thank you, he said. And the way he said it was almost careful, like the word was a small thing he was placing somewhere precise. Of course, I said. He went back into his office. I watched the door close. Hire immediately. Yes. I thought about that for a long time. It was raining on the Thursday of week 12, not polite rain. Not the kind that makes the city look romantic and cinematic. The kind that makes the city look gray and exhausted, that comes down in sheets and defeats umbrellas with cheerful efficiency. I had gotten soaked on my way in despite every precaution. My jacket was damp. My hair was a disaster. I arrived at my desk 8 minutes before my start time, hung my jacket over the back of my chair to dry, and tried to restore something like professional dignity before the day began. Jasper came in at 8 exactly, which was normal. He walked past my desk, paused, looked at me, a beat. "There are dry towels in the executive washroom," he said. "I'm fine," I said. "Your hair is wet, I'm aware," the faintest movement in his expression. "The towels are available," he said, and went into his office. I went and found the towels. They were, infuriatingly, very good towels. I felt substantially better. When I came back, there was a large cup of tea on my desk that had not been there before. Not coffee. Tea. I looked at the closed door of his office. Then at the tea, he had come out. Noticed I had taken his suggestion. Gone to the kitchen. Made me tea. I sat down, wrapped my hands around the warm cup, and had a brief and silent crisis about how completely and thoroughly I was in trouble. The rain story got around, because of course it did, not the tea part. But the general fact that I had arrived soaked had been seen by 2 other people on the executive floor, and offices are smaller social worlds than they appear. By lunch, Nadia from finance had made a sympathetic comment. By mid-afternoon, Cameron from legal had offered me a spare umbrella he apparently kept in his desk drawer. Cameron was, objectively, charming. Easy to talk to. He leaned against my desk and told a story about his own rain disaster from the previous winter, and I laughed and he laughed, and it was perfectly pleasant. I was aware, in my peripheral vision, of Jasper's door. It had been open for the past hour while he worked through a document review. It was the way I could sometimes see him from my desk at a certain angle. When Cameron finally left, I glanced toward Jasper's office. He was looking at me, not the quick, pulled-back glance of the usual office window moments. Directly. For just a second too long, then he looked down at his papers. I turned back to my screen and processed this slowly. Carefully, he had seen me talking to Cameron. He had looked up, not briefly, not quickly, but deliberately, and he had held the look for just a fraction past the point of ambiguity. This was information. I was a person who worked in data and details. I catalogued things. I compiled documents. I made order from scattered information. I had accumulated, over 12 weeks, a significant amount of data: the early hire decision, the car service, the 2 coffees and the thank you, the conference corridor, the tea after the rain, the plant and the music and the 3-word note in a margin, the look. I sat at my desk and thought. I could wait. I could keep compiling. I could be patient and careful and professional and see if it resolved itself, or I could do something about it. I decided to do something small. Deniable. An opening, not a declaration. The next morning, I put his courte-à-deux on his desk, which I had started doing occasionally when his schedule ran complex and he was deep in something by 8:15. I put it on a notepad, which I sometimes did when I had notes for him. The note said, "Mercer call confirmed for 10. Bellamy follow up in your inbox. Tea in the kitchen is also good in the rain, apparently." It was a reference. Just a reference. To the tea, to the rain, to a shared small thing that had happened. It was a sentence that could mean nothing. It could also mean, I noticed. I appreciated it. I went back to my desk. At 9, he came out for something and came back through. He paused beside my desk. I looked up. He was holding the notepad. He looked at the last line. Then at me. Something was happening in his expression. Something I hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen quite this clearly. It was subtle. With him it was always subtle, but it was there. A kind of warmth that he hadn't fully accounted for, that had arrived somewhere in his eyes before his composure could do anything about it. The tea was good, he said. And his voice was very quiet. Yes, I said. It was, a pause. Alexis. It was the first time he had used my first name. My heart stopped doing anything functional for approximately 3 seconds. Yes? I said. Very evenly. Very professionally. He looked at me for a moment longer. Something behind his eyes seemed to be making a decision. After the board meeting today, he said, I'll need 30 minutes. Not for work. I held his gaze. All right, he nodded. Went back into his office. I sat at my desk and breathed very deliberately for about 30 seconds. Not for work. The board meeting ran long. Of course it did. It ran 40 minutes past its scheduled end and I sat at my desk and tried to concentrate on 14 different things and managed to concentrate on 0 of them. At 5:40, the conference room doors opened and the board members filtered out and then, a few minutes after, Jasper. He came to my desk. Everyone else had gone toward the elevators. The floor was quieting. 30 minutes, he said. He went into his office and held the door open. I got up and followed him in. It was the first time I had been in his office for anything other than a direct work handoff. I had been in the doorway, plenty of times. But inside, with the door closed, in the lowering late afternoon light that turned everything gold, that was different. He sat on the edge of his desk. Not behind it. Just on the edge of it, arms loosely folded, looking at me. I sat in one of the chairs across from him. We were quiet for a moment. I'm not good at this, he said. At what, this? A pause. Saying things directly when they're not about business. You said something directly to me at the conference. About the startup. Something shifted in his expression. I did. That wasn't easy for you, no. A beat. But it felt right. Which doesn't happen often. I held his gaze. Waited. You've been working here for 3 months, he said. I've been. A pause. He seemed to be choosing words with unusual care. I'm aware that what I'm about to say is complicated by the nature of our working relationship. I want to acknowledge that directly. Okay, I said, and I want to say that I'm not asking for anything. I'm not putting you in a position. If you want to pretend this conversation didn't happen, I will respect that completely, Jasper, I said, and his name felt different in my mouth than anyone else's. What are you trying to say? He looked at me. Something that had been held very carefully behind those dark eyes for a long time seemed to have decided it was done waiting. I think about you, he said, simply. More than is professionally appropriate. I have since before you started here, the shortlist. Hire immediately. Yes. Before I started. I said, your application materials came to me as a formality. I was supposed to review and approve. I read your cover letter 3 times. He paused. It was direct. It said exactly what you could do and why it mattered and nothing else. It was the most honest document I had received in a very long time. I didn't say anything. My throat was doing something complicated, and then you arrived, he said, and you were exactly what the letter said. Efficient and precise and perceptive. And funny, sometimes, in a dry way you don't announce. A small pause. And you noticed things. About how I work. How I think. You anticipated things. Not because you were performing diligence but because you were paying attention, you were paying attention too. I said quietly, yes, he said. I was. The gold light was deepening. The city outside was beginning to light up for the evening. His voice was the quietest I had ever heard it. I don't know what you're thinking, he said. I have tried to read it and I can't. You're the only person I've met in some time whose thoughts I genuinely can't access. I thought you looked up every time I walked past, I said. Something moved in his face. You noticed that, Jasper. I tested it. I made unnecessary trips past your office. He stared at me. And then, for the first time in 3 months, Jasper George actually laughed. It was small and brief and quickly suppressed, but it was real and warm and completely changed the geometry of his face. You tested it, he said, 3 times in one morning, and, 6 for 6, I said. Every time, he shook his head slowly. Still with that trace of warmth in his expression. Efficient, he said, and the word landed differently now than it had in those early weeks. I wanted to be sure, I said. And were you? I was sure you were looking. I wasn't sure why. Now you know why. Now I know why, I agreed. A pause. Long and quiet and full. What are you thinking? He asked. And his voice was so careful. So genuinely unsure, in a way I had never heard him be unsure about anything. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that I have spent 3 months telling myself this was professional interest and completely standard executive observation behavior and that I was imagining things. You weren't imagining things, I know that now, and, he said, and there was something almost vulnerable in the word, which was the last thing I had ever expected from Jasper George, and it was also the thing that settled everything. And, I said, I made you tea once in my head. In an imaginary scenario. I thought you looked tired and I wanted to do something about it. I made you imaginary tea and then felt deeply embarrassed about it. He was very still. That's how I knew, I said. That it wasn't just professional interest. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he unfolded his arms and leaned forward slightly and said, I want to ask you to dinner. If that's something you're open to. Yes, I said. I am, not a work dinner. Just dinner. I understand the distinction, something that could, I thought, with enough generosity be called a smile crossed his face. Brief. Careful. Real. Saturday, he said. Saturday works, I said. I called Gideon on my way home that evening and said, he asked me to dinner. Gideon said, very calmly, I am going to need every single detail and I need them right now. I gave him every single detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a beat, and then he said, Alexis. He remembered the exact number of times he read your cover letter. 3, I said, 3. He read it 3 times. Alexis, I know, that man has been falling for you since before he met you. I know, I said again, and the warmth of it, the simple pure warmth of being known and wanting someone and having it turn out to be real rather than imagined, it spread through my chest like light through frosted glass. Saturday arrived and I spent an unreasonable amount of time getting ready, which I refused to detail except to say that I called Gideon twice and changed my jacket once. The restaurant Jasper had chosen was quiet and specific, not flashy, not trying to prove anything. A corner table, away from the main room, with actual space between it and other tables. The kind of place chosen by someone who wanted to be able to hear and be heard. He was there when I arrived. Already seated, which I had somehow not expected. He stood when he saw me come in. He was wearing a dark blue jacket, no tie, the same undone top button that was apparently his signature concession to informality. He looked warm. More so than usual. Or maybe I was seeing something that had always been there and had always been mine to see and I just hadn't permitted myself to look directly at it until now. You're on time, he said. I'm always on time, I said, I know. And something in the way he said it, simple, quiet, weighted with all the small evidence that he had been paying attention from the beginning, made it the most intimate thing anyone had said to me in years. We sat down, we talked for 4 hours, I mean that literally. We arrived at 7 and I looked up at some point to find the restaurant nearly empty and the staff doing the gentle final service things that restaurants do when they would like their last guests to realize it is getting on toward 11. We talked about the failed startups, mine and his, really talked, not the careful conference corridor version but the honest version with all the embarrassing details of hope and miscalculation. We talked about the city and what it was like to grow up somewhere else and arrive here and decide to stay. We talked about what we each wanted, not in the abstract but in the particular. The specific futures we could picture versus the ones we'd settled for. We talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, and the ease with which we moved between them was the biggest surprise of all. Jasper George, in private, in a quiet restaurant at a corner table, was not cold, he was precise and measured, yes. He still chose his words carefully and didn't raise his voice and held himself with that natural self-containment. But he listened, really, fully listened, in a way that I realized I had been starved for without knowing it, and when he said something, it landed with weight because he had thought about it and meant it, at one point, talking about something that had genuinely frustrated him. His hand moved across the table toward mine without any apparent intention behind it. Just moved. And rested near mine. Not touching, but near. I looked at our hands. Then at him. He looked at his hand like it had arrived there via a route he hadn't fully approved. Then he looked at me, apparently, he said, very drilly, my hand had an opinion. I laughed. He smiled. An actual one, small and crooked and completely real, and I felt it change something in my chest that I don't think ever went back to quite how it was before. I turned my hand over. His fingers settled into mine, easy and immediate, like it had been waiting to happen. They never fully resolved the question of the temperature in his office. I think it was approximately 68 degrees, which is fine if you're Jasper George and approximately 3 degrees colder than preferred if you're me. I kept a cardigan at my desk. He noticed, on the third day I wore it, and the next morning the thermostat had been moved to 69, he didn't say anything about it. I said, "Thank you." When he came out for his coffee, he said, "I don't know what you're referring to," and went back into his office. I smiled at my screen for considerably longer than 4 seconds. We kept things professional at work, which was the right thing to do and also, in its way, its own kind of joy, the shared privacy of something that was ours. Not on display, not performed. A world inside the world. The same desk, the same inbox protocol, the same 2 coffees and the same walks past the glass wall. Except now, when I walked past and glanced in, he didn't look away when he caught me looking back, he just looked. Steady and calm and present, the way he did everything. I had read an article once, early in my time at Halcyon, about Jasper George. One of those industry profiles that tried to make sense of him in 600 words. It had ended with a quote from a colleague, asked what it was like to work with him. "He runs cold," the colleague had said. "Nothing touches him." I thought about that sometimes, in the months that followed. About what it meant to decide you knew someone from the outside, to call something ice when maybe it was just careful. When maybe it was just the particular patience of a person who had decided that not everything deserved the full weight of what they were carrying. He melted, they said online. The Ice King Alpha melts every time his assistant walks past, and the funny thing was, they weren't wrong. They just didn't know what the melting looked like from the inside. They expected something dramatic, some visible thaw, some visible surrender. What it actually looked like was a thermostat moved 1 degree. A cup of tea left without explanation. A hand that decided, one evening in a quiet restaurant, that it had an opinion. What it actually looked like was a man who read a cover letter 3 times and wrote 3 words in a margin of a document and then waited, patient and still, for the rest of the story to arrive, and I walked past his office. And he looked up, and that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Subscribe, drop a comment, and I'll see you in the next story.